Judge Andrew Wallace and his rival, Judge Marcus Langley, were supposed to be upholding justice, yet one of them would cross a line that would shock the entire city. What began as whispers of a scandalous affair quickly spiraled into a deadly game of deception, betrayal, and revenge, leaving investigators racing against time to uncover the truth hidden behind a carefully crafted web of lies. The courthouse was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and tense rather than peaceful. The usual chatter of clerks, the shuffle of papers, and the echoing footsteps of lawyers heading to hearings were all missing, as if the building itself sensed that something was about to go terribly wrong. Judge Andrew Wallace had always been a figure of authority, respected and feared in equal measure. His courtroom decisions could change lives, and he carried the weight of that responsibility with a seriousness that often made him seem distant, even cold. But nobody expected that the gravity he carried in the courtroom would end with him lying dead in the very chambers where he exercised his power. The discovery of his body shocked everyone who worked in the courthouse. It was his assistant who first found him, entering his chambers with a stack of legal briefs, expecting to drop them off and receive a few brief instructions for the day. Instead, she was met with a scene that would haunt her for years. Judge Wallace slumped over his desk, lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, papers strewn around him in a chaotic mess. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken furniture, and no obvious weapon. The room was untouched in any violent sense, yet the presence of death made everything feel unnervingly out of place. The initial reports to the authorities were cautious. Investigators arrived quickly, cordoning off the area and beginning a meticulous examination. At first glance, the death seemed sudden, maybe even natural, as if the judge had collapsed from a heart attack or some unknown medical condition. But something about the scene didn't sit right with anyone who had known the judge or seen him at work. There was an intangible sense that this wasn't merely a tragic accident. As news of Judge Wallace's death spread through the city, speculation began almost immediately. Social media exploded with rumors and half-truths. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, trying to piece together a story from frightened staff who could hardly believe what had happened. Within hours, whispers about a scandal began circulating. Some claimed that the judge had been involved in a secret relationship, a rumor that quickly became sensationalized. The notion of a sex scandal gave the tragedy a salacious edge that drew public fascination, making headlines scream about betrayal, corruption, and hidden secrets. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense and paranoid. Lawyers whispered in hallways, clerks glanced nervously over their shoulders, and security personnel patrolled with heightened alertness. Everyone wondered who might have had the opportunity or motive to harm the judge. The initial investigation seemed simple: verify the cause of death, determine if foul play was involved, and look into the judge's personal life. But beneath the surface, there was a complexity that few understood. While the media focused on the alleged scandal, the detectives were quietly gathering evidence, examining documents, and interviewing staff members. They knew that the truth was rarely as simple as it seemed. Judge Wallace's life, though public and scrutinized, was layered with secrets and connections that were not visible to the casual observer. Each clue they uncovered hinted at a story far more intricate than any tabloid could imagine, one that involved power, hidden motives, and a series of events that would soon take the investigation in directions nobody expected. As the investigation into Judge Wallace's death progressed, detectives began peeling back layers of his life that few people had ever seen. His office, once a place of authority and order, revealed hidden compartments of secrets, files that seemed innocuous at first, yet contained delicate information about cases, personal correspondence, and notes that hinted at private struggles. Among the judge's emails, investigators found messages that were cryptic, carefully worded, and alarming in tone. Some suggested that someone was trying to pressure him, sending veiled threats that went beyond ordinary harassment. It was unclear whether these messages were connected to his professional rulings, personal life, or something entirely different, but the implication was undeniable. Someone wanted to control or manipulate him. The detectives began tracing the origins of these communications, following digital breadcrumbs that led to various contacts within the legal world. They discovered that Judge Wallace had been in contact with multiple colleagues, staff members, and even former litigants in ways that suggested he was navigating a complex web of pressures. One series of messages seemed to point toward blackmail, though not for money. Instead, the content suggested someone was trying to expose aspects of the judge's life that he had worked hard to keep private. The detectives realized that these communications could provide a motive for murder, but only if they could identify who stood to gain from the exposure. As investigators dug deeper, they found that the supposed scandal surrounding Judge Wallace's private life was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The judge had ruled against powerful entities in high-stakes cases, decisions that had created enemies in unexpected places. Lawyers who had once lost cases in his courtroom, staff members who had clashed with him over procedure, and even outside parties affected by his rulings all became potential suspects. Each person had a reason to resent him, yet none had an immediately clear path to committing a crime of this nature. The detectives began to understand that the death was not as simple as a crime of passion. It carried the hallmarks of careful planning. His firmness had earned him enemies, and in some cases, allies who were just as determined to protect themselves as he was to uphold justice. Forensic teams examined digital footprints, cross-referencing access logs, emails, and phone records. They discovered that several staff members had had unusual access to areas of the courthouse where sensitive information was stored, raising questions about internal security. The detectives realized that the network of people surrounding the judge was intricate, and any of them could have played a role in orchestrating events. The combination of personal secrets, professional rivalries, and hidden communications painted a picture of a man caught in a dangerous intersection of ambition, envy, and secrecy. As the layers of his life were exposed, it became clear that Judge Wallace's death was far more than a shocking headline. It was the center of a tangled and potentially deadly web, and every discovery brought investigators closer to a truth that few had anticipated. The investigation took a sharp turn as detectives began scrutinizing the alibis of those closest to Judge Wallace. On the surface, everything seemed straightforward. The lawyer allegedly involved in the scandal had been documented at a firm meeting across town, and multiple staff members who could have harbored grudges had confirmed they were elsewhere during the critical hours. Yet small inconsistencies began to emerge. Times didn't quite match, statements were vague, and certain details appeared rehearsed. The more the investigators probed, the more it became clear that someone had gone to great lengths to create the appearance of innocence. The security footage from the courthouse, initially thought to be routine, provided the first real breakthrough. Cameras at entrances, hallways, and elevators had recorded the morning of the murder in full, but most of the footage was unremarkable. Then, a review of the elevator cameras revealed a figure acting unusually. The person moved with precision, avoiding areas where cameras were obvious and pausing only when the angle of the lens was uncertain. There was a deliberate awareness in their movements that suggested premeditation. Though the figure's identity was obscured by shadows and the flow of traffic, The footage introduced the chilling possibility that someone had planned their entry and exit with a calculated understanding of the courthouse layout. Detectives focused on this mystery figure, analyzing patterns and cross-referencing timing logs. They noticed the individual took a route that bypassed common checkpoints and avoided interacting with anyone along the way. It was not a hurried flight of panic, it was careful, controlled, almost methodical. This level of awareness implied an intimate knowledge of the courthouse's inner workings, the kind that only a select few would possess. Every aspect of the morning, from movements to timing, seemed orchestrated to leave minimal trace, heightening suspicion that the murder had been carefully plotted rather than a spontaneous act. Meanwhile, other clues emerged that deepened the intrigue. Judge Wallace's personal devices, his phone, tablet, and laptop were meticulously examined, revealing encrypted files and messages that were deleted only hours before his death. Investigators found partial recovery of some of these communications, suggesting that the judge had been dealing with sensitive threats or information he hadn't shared with anyone. The content hinted at professional pressure, personal blackmail, and a growing unease that something was targeting him from within the courthouse itself. Each recovered fragment added tension, suggesting the judge had sensed danger but was unsure of the source. The detectives also revisited witness statements, noticing contradictions that initially seemed minor. People reported seeing individuals in areas where access was normally restricted. Some remembered faint noises or movements that, at the time, were dismissed as ordinary courthouse activity. Piecing these recollections together, a pattern began to form, highlighting that the killer had been moving strategically, taking advantage of every blind spot and every moment of distraction. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly evident that the case was not about chance or passion, but about control, secrecy, and calculated execution. The so-called scandal that had dominated headlines was, in reality, a diversion. The killer had carefully engineered an appearance of chaos, leveraging rumors, timing, and opportunity to mask the real motive. The detectives realized that the identity of the person in the footage held the key to unraveling the entire case, and uncovering it would reveal motives that went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Every lead, every observation, and every detail from that morning pointed to one unsettling truth: the murder had been planned with precision, and the person responsible was hiding in plain sight. Weeks into the investigation, a surprising lead shifted the focus entirely. Forensic analysis of Judge Wallace's chambers revealed a faint residue on his desk, almost imperceptible at first glance. Laboratory testing confirmed that it was a rare chemical, one not commonly found outside specialized environments. The presence of this substance suggested more than a rushed or opportunistic crime. It hinted at planning and knowledge of materials few people would have access to. Detectives traced the chemical back to a small forensic lab in the city, a lab that had recently been hired by a party connected to one of Judge Wallace's most high-profile cases. That case had involved a massive corporate fraud scandal, one that had ended with a ruling against a powerful company. The decision had angered executives, lawyers, and even some insiders who had hoped to manipulate the outcome. Suddenly, the investigation took on a new dimension. The focus was no longer a personal scandal, a clandestine affair, or internal rivalries within the courthouse. It became clear that someone had a vested interest in revenge, a calculated effort to punish Judge Wallace and send a message to anyone else who might cross them. The initial story of sex scandal and gossip was merely a smokescreen, a way to draw attention away from the real motive that was professional, financial, and personal. Detectives began digging into the judge's recent case history with renewed urgency. They identified individuals who had suffered significant losses due to his rulings, people who had the means, opportunity, and motive to orchestrate a complex plan. Each lead, however, came with complications. Many of the individuals had plausible alibis, and there was no direct evidence linking them to the rare chemical found at the scene. It became clear that the mastermind was not only meticulous but also clever enough to use others as shields, directing suspicion elsewhere while hiding their true involvement. Investigators revisited courthouse staff and colleagues, focusing on those with intimate knowledge of Judge Wallace's movements, schedules, and habits. It was evident that someone had exploited this knowledge to time the murder perfectly, leaving just enough confusion to create doubt about motives. Staff members who had seemed innocent began to appear more complicated upon closer examination. Each person's interactions, schedules, and behaviors were mapped against the judge's routine, uncovering gaps and anomalies that had initially been overlooked. The intricate web of relationships and access made it clear that the killer had not acted in isolation. At the same time, the media frenzy surrounding the alleged scandal continued to grow, unintentionally aiding the investigation. Public attention on a supposed personal affair meant that the true nature of the crime, the calculated act of vengeance, remained hidden, allowing detectives to quietly follow evidence without interference. Every piece of recovered data, every fragment of information, and every obscure clue led back to the same unsettling conclusion: Judge Wallace's death had been orchestrated with a level of foresight that far exceeded anything previously considered. The stakes were higher than anyone imagined, and the detectives understood that uncovering the full truth would require untangling decades of professional relationships, personal secrets, and long-standing rivalries, all while navigating a labyrinth designed to mislead them at every turn. The investigation had shifted from scandal to strategy, from rumor to revenge. Each discovery brought the team closer to understanding the killer's identity and motive, revealing a story far more chilling than anyone could have predicted, a story that combined meticulous planning, professional grudges, and a shocking level of deception that would soon turn the case on its head. The final breakthrough came when investigators analyzed every angle of the forensic and digital evidence together, revealing a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. The rare chemical, the unusual movements caught on camera, and the meticulously deleted communications all pointed towards someone with both access and intimate knowledge of the courthouse. It was no longer a question of whether the murder had been planned; it was clear it had. What shocked the investigators most was that the person responsible was not a peripheral figure or an obvious suspect, but someone embedded within the very system meant to uphold justice, a fellow judge. This judge had worked closely with Wallace on multiple high-profile cases and had observed his routines, habits, and interactions over years. Their professional rivalry had been well known in legal circles, but no one had imagined it could escalate to murder. The suspect had carefully studied Wallace's daily schedule, learned the courthouse's blind spots, and used a combination of insider knowledge and manipulation to orchestrate the crime. They had planted misleading evidence to divert attention toward a supposed sex scandal, creating a narrative designed to discredit Wallace while masking the true motive: revenge for perceived professional slights and fear of exposure in cases that could damage their own reputation. Investigators discovered that the chemical found on Wallace's desk had been intentionally left as a subtle marker, something only someone with access to specialized labs and materials could have arranged. Security footage and timing logs were also manipulated, designed to obscure the killer's movements and create the illusion of uncertainty. Even the emails and texts that hinted at blackmail were part of a carefully crafted distraction, designed to make it appear that Wallace's private life was the focus, when in reality the murder was meticulously planned to cover a professional vendetta. The depth of the deception stunned the investigative team. Every lead, every false clue, and every misleading rumor had been engineered to protect the killer while directing suspicion elsewhere. The so-called scandal that had dominated headlines was nothing more than a smokescreen, a tool to mask ambition and premeditation. Colleagues who had seemed friendly or neutral were reevaluated under a new lens, and subtle patterns of behavior that had gone unnoticed for months suddenly made sense. The killer's manipulations extended beyond the courthouse, influencing witnesses, staff, and even public perception to create a story that distracted from the truth. As authorities moved to confront the suspect, the magnitude of the scheme became clear. This was not a crime of impulse, passion, or personal betrayal. It was a calculated act of control, executed with precision and foresight. The killer had exploited trust, knowledge, and access in ways that were both chilling and unprecedented. The realization that someone sworn to uphold the law could orchestrate such a crime sent shockwaves through the legal community and the city as a whole. When the arrest was made, the public narrative of scandal and rumor collapsed. The truth emerged: Judge Wallace's death had been a professional assassination hidden beneath layers of manipulation, lies, and misdirection. The revelation left everyone questioning appearances, motives, and the very nature of trust within institutions meant to protect justice. What had begun as a story of betrayal had transformed into a cautionary tale of ambition, deception, and a deadly desire to preserve power, exposing a level of calculation and ruthlessness few could have imagined. The case ended not with sensational gossip, but with the sobering recognition that the real story, the one that had been concealed beneath every headline, was far darker, far more intricate, and far more human than anyone had expected.